Welcome to the Workplace Ninja Netherlands podcast, a series on Microsoft's modern workplace management.
So we're back with a new recording of the Workplace Ninja podcast, and in this time the workplace management series that we have started a few times ago, and we're continuing that one. Last time we talked about the settings catalog, really interesting topic. And now we're moving forward. Almost the same people on the table: Erik Loef, Kenneth Versurksum, Joost Gelijsteen, and me, myself, and I, Frans Oudendorp. We're really back with a new topic, and the topic is, Joost?
Conditional access.
So we're moving into conditional access, and we have really the expert on conditional access in the Netherlands on the table, Kenneth. I think you wrote a lot about this topic. You have a lot of experience with it, sharing your knowledge about that on your own blog, but also in presentations that we've seen, I think a few months ago in Almkerk also.
Yeah.
What are the specific topics within conditional access that we need to tip in this recording?
Well, first of all, I think that it's not only a matter of only implementing conditional access. There are a lot of things, prerequisites or depending products which must be configured correctly as well in order to have a good conditional access implementation, to say so. Be careful with implementing it, because eventually you are able to lock yourself out of your tenant if you're not fully aware of what your conditional access policies are doing. So they can be very careful. And actually, in my first trials with conditional access, I also managed to get myself locked out of my own tenant at that point in time. And that was quite interesting, because if you want to regain access to your environment, you need to create a support call with Microsoft in order to be able to access your tenant again. And that can take days. So it's not like they are going to help you on the minute, if that's the case. So be very careful with that as well.
And nowadays, within the conditional access, if you're configuring and there is your own user account is targeted at that moment, there's a message popping up. Don't lock yourself out, and so please be aware of that.
Indeed, but even though some people still manage to do that, and that's mainly caused by maybe not truly understanding what conditional access can do. And maybe also some other mistakes that you can make, which can lead to the same results.
Yeah, mistakes. Let me park that one until the end. So maybe we can have some anecdotes around that topic, for example. But to start, prerequirements. Or depending solutions. What do you mean with prerequisites? What are there for conditional access?
Yeah, so to start, there are a couple of things which are important, but I think the biggest requirement that you need in order to be able to leverage Azure AD conditional access is Azure AD. And that's something that not everyone is really aware of. But for example, if you have, as a company, you're using all kinds of cloud-based applications which have their own login system, we are not able to protect those applications with conditional access. So your identity provider or the system providing access to the resource should be Azure AD. And once you are using Azure AD, you can start using conditional access.
And what about if I'm using Okta as an IDP or Okta on top of Azure AD? Is that possible to use that in combination with each other? Or
I do believe it is. And don't get me wrong, there are probably other solutions which have conditional access-like functionality. But in the end, it starts with the identity provider and the functionality running on top of that, making things possible. That's something I see at many customers. Some customers think they have like SaaS applications that they have single sign-on, but in the end, it's not like single sign-on, but for example, a password saved in their browser, giving them a single sign-on experience. In the end, if we do further investigations, we see that not Azure AD is being used as the identity provider, and therefore we cannot protect that application using conditional access. Yeah. So the first thing actually to do is to make sure that we bring the sign-on experience to Azure AD by configuring SAML, OpenID, making sure that we can log in with the credentials that you have, which gives us more possibilities, of course. And then we can use conditional access as a way to determine in what scenario access is granted to access that application. A big advantage is, of course, though, that if you are using the Microsoft 365 applications like Teams, OneDrive, SharePoint, we of course already are using Azure AD, so it's easy to protect those kind of applications.
Erik, what about as an MSP? Are you using conditional access a lot for smaller customers as well?
Yes, conditional access is the way of enabling MFA and enabling, of course, one other prerequisite is having a break glass account and having block basic authentication, block active sync, there's all protocols. So you have to also have a prerequisite new protocols, modern authentication. And then we're using, as a first step, block basic, block active sync, and enable MFA. That are the basic conditional access rules you have to start with, and then on top of you can build your own dream. But this is the basic you need to be covered in conditional access. That's the first step of implementing conditional access and then looking from an MSP perspective, good naming convention. So you can see the groups, exclusion groups, inclusion groups, the name of the conditional access policy. It has to be the same on every tenant, because if you have a naming convention which differs in all the tenants, you don't know what you're managing. So that's are very important steps when you're managing hundreds of tenants with conditional access.
Yeah. One thing regarding Kenneth, regarding the prereqs, we have Azure AD, but you also mentioned dependencies. What are the dependencies within Azure Active Directory?
Well, take for one big dependency, of course, depending on how you implement conditional access, could be, for example, a dependency on Intune and using the compliance status of devices in order to determine whether a device is compliant or not. And based on the compliancy status of a device, we can determine the scenario where we grant or maybe deny access or do other stuff with that. Because from an Intune perspective, a device is either compliant or not compliant.
That's compliance. Can it also be used outside Intune? So if I use VMware or Citrix MDM, can I use compliance within that area as well?
I'm not really certain on that. I don't think you can use the compliance state from those MDM systems. So there are some integrations possible, but I'm not really certain whether that's fully integrated into Azure AD, because the compliancy status, it should integrate into how Microsoft measures that.
Yeah, I think you're right on that, but I'm not sure as well.
On the other hand, it could be that those solutions also provide conditional access-like functionality, giving the same functionality as we have within Azure AD. But to be honest, I'm not experienced enough on those platforms to say anything meaningful about that.
Yeah. Joost, if we look at conditional access, what is the use case for you within larger environments where you start with? Is that the same as Erik mentioned already, blocking basic authentication, all the legacy protocols, and enabling MFA.
Yeah, those are the first steps, but probably it's also good to, because I've learned a lot of things, sometimes from candidates as well, maybe a lot, is to use the what if function in the conditional access to see what's happening before enabling it. You got the report only, you got it off, or you got it on. First step is maybe when you trying to create a policy, see what it's doing with the what if function. There you can fill in a user, location, and that kind of stuff, and which policies are your users going to be hit at, or devices. And next step is in report only, and see what's happening in real life. And if it's already for you a good situation, you can turn it on. So those are the bigger learning steps I did. And
so you need to count to 3 on that. Do a what if, set on report only to see what's happening, and then as the last step, the third one is to enable a conditional access policy in your environment to be sure that you covered everything and that no one is locked out and so on.
Yeah, that's actually a good remark, because let's say if you have, for example, 10 applicable conditional access policies, and there's one which actually blocks access, the other 9 don't matter anymore. So block access always wins, and therefore you should be really careful. But again, the only way we can do that is make sure that we have the break class accounts, as Erik already mentioned. Make sure that those accounts are protected using MFA, don't get me wrong. But make sure that they are excluded from your conditional access policies. So that in case something goes wrong, you can always use that break class account in order to turn that policy off, or in report only mode again. And those are some of the prerequisites that we already talked about, that you some must be in place and others should be in place, and that's the main difference there. To add to Joost, Joost was talking about putting in report only mode. That will make sure that we can actually see whether the policy would have been applicable to every sign-in request. And we can further extend that by turning on diagnostic settings in Azure AD, making sure that all the signing logs are being sent to Log Analytics. And from there we have some workbooks available which can help us as well to determine the impact of possibly turning on the conditional access policy in the end. And based on especially the retention that you have within the Log Analytics settings, you can of course have an review back as many days as your retention is on the workspace, of course.
And in your experience, when you're testing, how much time does it take to the CA policy you created is being affected to the user or to the device? Because I know there's a waiting time in it, but do you have some time window, what you've seen, because you made a lot?
Yeah, well, there it's important to know when conditional access kicks in, and that's actually by when requesting an access token or when re-requesting a refresh token. So when tokens are refreshed, and that really depends on when that is happening. So sometimes it can take some time before the policy kicks in. It depends. But in most cases, if you enable a conditional access policy in report-only mode, you within 1 hour you see a logging popping up, giving you detail on what the policy is doing.
So that's a good one. Good advice as well. Take time to create, test.
Indeed, yeah, and don't expect that if you hit on the on button on your conditional access policy, that it will be effectively immediately.
One important thing, the conditional access, was for me, my first experience with conditional access was conditional access kicks in after you log in. So what I experienced in my sign-in logs, I see many failed login attempts. For example, somebody from China is logging in on SMTP protocol or whatever, EMAP, when basic authentication was enabled in those days. And now, I have a block policy. But then you still get risky sign-ins because conditional access, because that was strange for me. But, hey, I blocked that in conditional access, but conditional access only starts after logging in. So that was for me a learning path to understand it.
Yeah, that's sometimes people actually compare it with a firewall, but the firewall blocks at the entrance. And indeed here you first go to Azure AD, try to sign in, and then the conditional access kicks in. And Microsoft also tells us about that behavior, that conditional access cannot be seen as a tool to circumvent or to make sure that denial of service doesn't take place. But keep in mind that around services like Azure AD, Microsoft, of course, has all kinds of tooling available to make sure that denial of service doesn't take place.
When looking into conditional access, it's about conditions based on getting access to specific resources or applications.
Yeah.
That starts, if we start with a conditional access policy, that starts with an assignment.
Indeed.
What is the preferred approach? Having conditional access based on all users and making some exclusions, or doing conditional access based on groups where you probably some dynamic groups where we have all users fitted in a specific group, or what else? What is the preferred approach for you, Kenneth, to use that assignments based on users, for example?
Yeah, my preferred method is all users. The reason for that is I want to make sure that in case somebody has some control over the tenant or the environment and is able to create a user account, that even that newly created account falls under the regime of the conditional access policies. Making sure that if that account, if they want to start using that, for example, that MFA is always necessary. And that's actually the only way to do it. So in my set of conditional access policies, I think more than 90% is targeted to all users. And besides that, we have, of course, special use cases. For example, having passwordless MFA for if you have an admin role, which is not targeted to all users, but will become active once you receive the admin role, which can either be permanent or, if you're using privileged identity management, will become active at the moment that you activate your role in question.
Yeah, and then anything to add, Joost? Erik?
Not
to the user-specific
specific, make it as granular as possible and only do the exclusions. That's the way we work. Then otherwise, when you grow and you move and something happened, if you have all users, you always know everybody is in it, and only the specific guys you excluded aren't in there. So then you have covered all users. So when a user added, then you are sure it's as granular as possible.
Yeah, if there's a specific new user and someone has created that user and it's not targeted in a specific group where conditional access is active, you're not knowing if someone is part of a policy. If you target it to all users, you know everyone will always be targeted by that.
Yeah, so to give you an idea on how I implement that, I always target to all users. I have an exclusion group per policy, so which is unique per policy, so that we can make granular exceptions. And I always have a group which contains my break loss accounts, which are accepted as well. And for actually those two groups, those exclusion groups, I have the KQL queries, which I built in Azure Monitor, or log analytics, or maybe Sentinel if being used, which actually alerts me when new users are being added to those groups.
Yeah, and if we continue and looking, I have the right page. Yeah, if we're looking at the second step, you need to choose a specific cloud applications or actions.
Yeah.
What are the three different types that we can use there?
We can, of course, select certain cloud applications, all cloud apps, or maybe a specific set of cloud apps.
Is there in this time, is there already still the possibility if you select all cloud apps? In the past, I know there were some difficulties with Graph API, for example, because there is no cloud app.
Yeah, that's actually a good remark. You can select all cloud apps, but not all cloud apps can be accepted can be set as an exception in that case.
Yeah.
And for example, it's not advised to create a conditional access policy targeted to all cloud apps which blocks access, because it can break a lot of things, blocking access to endpoints which are not defined as a separate application within conditional access. So you can use all cloud apps, for example, when requiring MFA. But my advice would be not to create a block access policy to all cloud apps, because it can break a lot of things, and you will probably not know if conditional access is the one breaking it.
Yeah.
In that case.
Yeah. And the first thing was cloud apps. Second thing, user actions.
Yeah, so I think we have the, what is it, the registration,
The registration for security information,
Yeah.
and the register or join devices.
Yeah, so the register or join devices is also a setting which can be done on the global level within Azure AD,
Yep.
on whether that is needed. But it's now advised, and that's also mentioned within Azure AD, to replace that to conditional access. And by conditional access, we could create exceptions, but I wouldn't advise to do that. I think the best way is to always request MFA when a user wants to join or register a device.
And the next thing, authentication context. That is, I think it's related to cloud app security, Defender for Cloud Apps nowadays.
Yeah, and also to the sensitivity labels. So what Authentication Context is doing is actually you can define a label, and the label is nothing more than a label, but that label can then be used within a sensitivity label. For example, when going to a SharePoint site, which is protected by a sensitivity label, you can then protect it with or tag that with the the context in that case, and then actually it will kick off a conditional access policy requiring MFA. And the same can be done within Defender for Cloud Apps, where we can actually leverage that same label as well. Yeah. So, but those are the more advanced scenarios. And now Microsoft also added support within privileged identity management to use that authentication context as well. So, for example, if you elevate to global administrator, we can kick off an extra conditional access policy requiring passwordless MFA, for example. So that's a new option recently introduced as well.
I think that will be great, because privileged identity management is you're elevating your permissions within in a certain tenant.
Yeah.
So your conditional access or a global admin, for example, and if you are doing that with an SMS or, for example, another method that is you're doing MFA, but it's less secure than passwordless or the phishing things that we have already.
And there, not to confuse things, but we just talked about authentication context, and that's actually where authentication strength kicks in. And authentication strength is something that we are going to discuss a little bit later.
Yep.
But there we can define which authentication methods are allowed to use to fulfill the conditional access rule, to say so.
Yeah. So we have the users, we have the cloud applications, or the actions that we have. Then we can configure the conditions. That's based on the user risk, on the sign-in risk, on a device platform. That can be iOS, Windows, macOS, or whatever. Based on locations, and I will come to that one shortly. We have client apps. Client apps that can be an active sync client, that can be a web browser, for example, or whatever. And filter for devices, that is one we discussed in the previous recording. So targeting a configuration policy to all devices or users. Is that the same functionality, more or less?
concerning the filters, you mean?
Yeah, filter for devices.
Yeah, well, we have filters within Intune and we have filters within Azure AD Conditional Access. They have similar functionality, but they are not one-on-one in par with each other. And it's not like if you define the filter in Intune that you have it within Conditional Access, so you need to create it both ways. But for example, a filter within Conditional Access could be a hybrid AD joint device or a registered device, or maybe a device with a specific category defined. So actually, we have some possibilities there to, and that's especially useful when targeting all users, because a user can work on different devices. There the filtering can actually help which conditional access policy is applicable to that scenario. Sometimes the user is working on the company managed device, which is compliant, and the other day the user is working on a non-managed device, which is not compliant. And therefore, even though the policies are targeted to all users, the different policies are active based on that scenario in that case.
And if we come back to the locations, that is a hard part for many customers, because based on that, we can do certain things.
Yeah.
What locations should we use within conditional access, in your opinion? And maybe Erik can add up to that later on. What is normal? What are normal use cases that we have already? Because we talk in the when we are discussing before this meeting, we already talked about that a little bit. But what location should we use?
Yeah, if you would ask me, none.
But okay, none. But
the reason why I'm telling that, because eventually, if you are a cloud-only environment, it shouldn't matter anymore where your devices are situated. And we are adopting the zero trust strategy, where we always need to verify stuff. But the locations are still in handy. But I see the main purpose for the locations for actually everything that's being considered hybrid. But I think maybe Erik can tell a little bit more about that.
Yeah, we had a discussion up front of this recording about enabling MFA in a certain environment, for example.
Now, before COVID-19, it was really common to have the office location excluded from MFA. It was more normal than an exception. Then there was COVID-19, everybody was at home, and I was doing the MFA part. Then we also moving more faster to modern. We have to use Teams. So from now on, it is more common to have non-location excluded from MFA, because what Kenneth says, it's the cloud. Because it doesn't matter if you're on location or not. We have to enable MFA. Only if a part where you use the location is, for example, when you make an exception where MFA is not possible for some kind of legacy application we have to interact. Then you say, for that IP address combined to that user, it's only allowed. That is a security measure. That's the way location. Then you have also the geolocation part. So I want to have, for example, for schools, that's what we use, is enable only logging in from the Netherlands, because on a school it's very hard to implement MFA because all the students, nobody wants. Even also for the teachers it's hard. So what we do is, as MFA part, to make it a little bit more secure than nothing, only from the Netherlands. But what we also experience, and that's Microsoft is fixing, is the IPv6, because everybody has Ziggo at home, and then they have IPv6 address, and conditional access doesn't understand IPv6. There, so you're also in. So it's not a very good solution. In theory, it was a good solution. When we implemented it, it was a bad solution. So that's where we ended.
Yeah, you're mentioning IPv6. Is there already support for IPv6 in this case for conditional access?
Yeah, so recently Microsoft started supporting IPv6 in Azure AD, and is now requesting customers to, if you are using locations, to also define the IPv6 ranges in that case.
Okay.
So I want to add 2 remarks to the what Eric said. What we see as reasons to use locations. One could be to only allow MFA registration from within trusted locations. So, for example, we have a new employee coming into the office. That employee can only do the first registration of MFA within the office. That's a possibility to use, and that's something we can determine within a conditional access policy. And the last thing I wanted to mention, based on locations, is what I see regularly at customers, is that they have 2 wireless networks, where actually the first wireless network is being used to access company resources, and the second one is being used to give guest users access to the internet. But both IP addresses are actually coming out, or both networks actually go out through the same IP address. And therefore, you should really ask yourself whether you want that guest network to be trusted as well.
Yep.
And if you can't accomplish that, maybe you shouldn't implement the measures, or see if you can let the guest network break out using a different public IP address. Because in the end, this is determined, what is being, a location is determined on the public IP address, which is seen by Azure AD.
Yeah, and what I learned this week regarding this is registering your security info. You can do that based on a location. So if you can enable that only on your office location, for example. But you can also require MFA for your security registration.
Yeah. So that's actually the use case for the temporary access pass, where the temporary access pass fulfills the MFA requirement.
There's an MFA token within the temporary access
Indeed,
pass.
And due to that, and based on the settings that you set for your temporary access pass, you can use that one time only, for example, or time bound, to say so. So I think that's the temporary access pass is a good solution to use.
It's more secure, and if you're in a high privileged environment, probably it's a good use case to move on onwards to that.
Yeah, indeed.
If we have looked at the assignments, the users, cloud application, and the conditions that are necessary for that. Then we look at the access controls, because we give access to or block access. That are the 2 main parts within the access controls.
Yeah. Again, be careful with blocking access. So block access to the legacy authentication protocols, block access to Exchange Active Sync, and be careful with all the other block rules that you create. Be very careful with them. Yeah.
Otherwise, if you lock yourself out, you're already mentioning that it takes a few days to get back in with Microsoft support.
Yeah, and sometimes I see people implementing block rules while they can also do it with a grant rule, and then having a second thing which must be fulfilled. Yeah,
you have to think about it, and maybe if you want to block, do a turnaround think. To see if
Indeed.
You can enable that on another way.
Yeah. So, for example, giving only access to compliant devices, you could create a conditional access policy blocking access to non-compliant devices.
Yeah, but
the best thing would be to create an access policy which grants access to compliant devices. That would be a better way to solve this.
Okay. Within grant, we have the possibility to require an multi-factor. Require authentication strength.
Yeah, which is actually the replacement of multi-factor.
Yeah, is authentication strength. What are the types that we have within authentication strength?
I think we currently have more than 13, 14 MFA methods available. And what you can do is actually within authentication strength define which of those 14 options you want to allow for that specific conditional access policy.
Yeah, that are like passwordless MFA, phishing resistant MFA.
Yeah, SMS.
And the multi-factor authentication. And
indeed.
within that, segments, there are a few other settings as well.
Yeah. So we now see the challenge that Microsoft is facing. More and more companies are starting to use MFA. They are also told, hey, MFA is secure, and I fully agree. But within MFA, there are certain methods which are less secure, and some of them are more secure. And if you want to, if you already are using MFA and you want to start moving your users towards using more secure MFA methods, this is one of the ways to accomplish that.
Yeah.
We also see that last week new functionality was introduced so that you can enable Azure AD to always request the most secure registered MFA methods. So you see that all kinds of functionality is popping up, making sure that you can make the transition towards using better MFA methods.
Yeah. Probably, if we are diving into MFA, we can invite Jan Bakker probably sometimes for that topic as well.
Yeah, Jan is always on top of any new ways to configure this, and he has some. He's always
he's running up front.
One of the first people knowing about this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. The third and the fourth option that I have in the grant access is a device marked to be compliant and require a hybrid Azure AD joint device. So we can also combine a multi-factor with a registered or a compliant device within that.
Yeah. So let me get this straight. The device is either compliant, which can be your Windows, Mac OS, but also Android and iOS device, of course. And we now even have the option to have Linux compliant devices. And maybe we're going towards Chrome compliant devices as well. But and we have the hybrid AD joint, which is of course an Active Directory joint device, which is registered in Azure AD as well. You can use that method, but it's not like it's a compliant device, yes or no. So whether or not to use that option heavily depends on how much you trust your security within your AD environment.
I thought that option was also deprecated, so it will be changed by filters or not? They changed it.
No, you can still, that's actually a good one. There's, of course, the option to exclude devices within the filters, but require it in the grant control. And it's a little bit difficult to explain it here, but there are different use cases to either use the grant control or use the filtering.
Yeah.
So, maybe a good idea maybe for a blog post on when to use which one, but I don't think it's... I don't think it's okay that we are going to discuss that specific topic at this moment. Yeah.
Okay. The next few things are a require approved client app or a protection policy. So that is more related to the mobiles, I guess.
Yeah, that's related to mobile application management. So as you know, we can protect the apps on the mobile devices, and that can be done in two ways, either by checking whether an app from a list of approved apps is being used. So Microsoft has a list of approved apps, more than 100 apps. If that app is being used, you can allow access. Or you can say, I want to make sure that that app is also protected by an app protection policy coming from Intune. The most important remark that I have is that the list of approved client apps and apps which are supported on the app protection policies is not one-on-one the same.
There's a difference.
Yeah, so I actually have an Excel list available on my GitHub where I sometimes compare that functionality. And now for the Office application, that functionality is on par, so you can start moving there. But it's not like all applications which you have now within your approved client apps list is supported when having an app protection policy applied. So you should be careful there, or create two separate policies. One, making sure that an app protection policy is there, and make sure that all the apps that you protect are also in the supported list, and create a second one for the approved client apps. But also here, my advice would be to keep it simple.
As simple as it could be.
Yeah.
Yeah. The last thing, require password change. That's the integration with identity protection. So we have a lot of a lot. We have a few settings that we can configure in identity protection to also do the security registration, and I want to have a little discussion on that in a few seconds. But security registration can be done within identity protection. Block on risky users or having a password change, but also the required password change is moving into conditional access. What is the preferred method for you to configure if you have identity protection? So you have the license, you can use it. Should you do it within identity protection or within conditional access?
Yeah, my preferred method would be conditional access, because there all my policies live, and I don't want policies to be fragmented around different products. So I would say use conditional access for that.
Is that within your environment, Erik? Is that also?
No, because all my customers are using Business Premium and there's an Azure DPT function, so it's too costly for most SMB customers.
But you have all the information. You can't use Azure AD identity protection, but the information is probably in the tenant available. Yep. You can't use it also within conditional access, because this is one of the things that you have already there.
No, so if you don't have any P2 license, you don't have the controls available to select
and
in
they
your
will be grayed
access
out or something else.
Yeah, they are not there.
Okay.
No. Yeah.
Okay. Then the last thing is the session part within access controls.
Yeah, now it becomes interesting.
And there are a lot. I think there are 7 or 8 things that I can select. I can configure. The session thing, use app enforced restrictions.
Yeah.
What's that?
Well, app enforced restrictions allow you to put Outlook Web Access and SharePoint into to leverage some functionality in there, allowing you to block the option to download or print attachments or download from SharePoint. So if you have app enforced restrictions applied to, for example, Office 365, and the user, in most cases, we are targeting that to users working on non-compliant devices, they can work within the browser, they can start Outlook Web Access, but they can, if they, for example, have an email with an attachment, so they can only save that to their OneDrive or to SharePoint.
Yeah, and the second thing is use conditional access app control. That's more or less the same. What's the difference?
Well, the app control is actually rerouting the session through Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps.
Yeah, but it has almost the same functionality.
Yeah, but in Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps, which is a P2 functionality again, so you need other license, but you have you can actually you are rerouting the session into Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps, and within there you have a whole set of different other policies which you can set on that session. So it's far more complicated than that.
And it's not limited to SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, Exchange Online.
No, indeed, it's actually you can use that for any cloud application supporting it. Yeah. Therefore, for example, if you have like Salesforce, the use case would be okay, on a compliant device you can download invoices. But if you are using Salesforce on a non-compliant device, we block the download of Salesforce or of any documents coming from Salesforce.
Yeah, another difference is that if we're using Salesforce, for example, we can configure that within the Defender for Cloud Apps. So there's no change that have to be made within Salesforce.
Indeed.
The only thing that we need to do is register that application in Azure AD.
Yeah.
The app enforced restrictions that needs configuration specifically in Exchange Online or in SharePoint Online.
Indeed, so you can do that in multiple ways. So you can, for example, determine that on the global level, then it will be applicable to all SharePoint sites. You can do that on the SharePoint level by using PowerShell, for example. Or you can use sensitivity labels, and within the sensitivity label define the behavior of app enforced restrictions depending on which sensitivity label is being set on the SharePoint site.
Yeah. Erik, if you look into small, medium business customers, conditional access app control is not part of your business because it's a P2 functionality. But the first one, app enforced restrictions, is that part of it's part of the license, and will that be used in that sort of configurations as well?
No, there's no at the moment no requirements. There are all other things the users want. Then first you have to ramp up to a compliant device and make that happen. And the mobile device managing is really hard because not everybody has a managed mobile, and then you have the MAM functionality. That's always not possible. So there are other struggles yet. So that app enforced restriction is for me the end part when you have done everything with like compliance. You have your mobiles, you have the MAM, you have the MDM functionality all in place. Then you can think of that kind of extra functionality. But 99% of all the SMB customers are in the process from moving from MFA to compliant device. That's the adding the mobiles, so they are getting convenient with having an app from the customer on the private mobile. Now we can move on. Now you have more the Authenticator app, and now you have to add extra apps. So that's the struggle in the SMB market for what we face.
Yeah, Joost, how is that within somewhat larger customers?
More with the what Kenneth already said with the settings in SharePoint. When something is more confidential, then do something with it. That's more likely to happen.
Yeah, so using app enforced restrictions is more commonly used in that sort of configurations than the conditional access app control.
Yeah, but the challenge is always, especially in existing tenants, which steps can you take to go to the point where you want to be? And as Eric is mentioning, it all depends on how willing the customer is to make those changes. For example, if a critical security incident has taken place, there's maybe more priority to do so. And the best way to actually do this is to while running a project and helping the customer to transition towards a modern workplace. Yeah. And then these things, they can be part of that implementation.
Okay, next one, sign-in frequency.
Yeah.
Is that heavily used already?
Yeah, if you would ask me, yes. So, for example, what I normally do is when working on a non-compliant device, we only allow access using the web browser on non-compliant devices, so the apps cannot be used. And within the web browser, we set a sign-in frequency of 1 day, making sure that if the user is not working on the device, that they are eventually logged out after 1 day, making sure that no one else can use that session.
Yeah, and then you require again an MFA request, and if that's done, the user can continue to work.
They need to log in again.
Yeah.
Using those requirements. We now also have an option outside of conditional access to lock users out after being idle for a certain time, which can be used in combination as well.
Yeah.
But I think that at least on non-compliant devices, so devices which you don't manage, requiring users to log in once per day is the minimum security that you should apply. Yeah.
Persistent browser session.
Actually used in combination with sign-in frequency, which actually removes all the session cookies after the browser is closed. So if the user is working, closes the browser, opens the browser again, they need to re-log in. And there are a couple of things which are quite interesting here, is that, for example, if the browser crashes, the cookie is not removed. So the user can start the session again. But in the end, I always have the example of the internet cafe. If a user logs in from the internet cafe and closes the browser, you don't want the second user sitting behind that browser to open the window again, go to portal.office.com and come to the conclusion that he or she doesn't need to log in because the session is still there.
Yeah.
And that's something we can circumvent by using the combination of the signing frequency, including and the persistent browser session setting.
Yeah. Continuous access evaluation.
Yeah.
What do we do with that?
Well, continuous access evaluation is actually a functionality where certain Microsoft products, like SharePoint and Exchange, and don't get me wrong if I'm missing some other products, are able to detect earlier whether an account has been locked out. And by using that functionality, continuous access evaluation, we get quicker lockout times because the token needs to be refreshed more frequent, or the service knows that the account has been disabled, where we have quicker results if the user gets disabled, and the time it takes for the user to be actually locked out of the session.
Yeah, if you are removed from a specific group, and based on that group, that you have access, and that's removed.
Yeah. So continuous access evaluation is actually turned on by default always, and the only option you have is to actually disable it in certain cases where something doesn't work as expected.
The next one, disable resilience defaults.
Yeah, that's a good one as well.
Something
you
about
don't want
outages.
Yeah, well, resilience defaults is actually based on a functionality within Azure AD that if in case there is something wrong with Azure AD, there is always a backup service for Azure AD.
Yeah.
And the backup service is able to provide refresh tokens, but it cannot handle any new authentications. What this setting does, it determines whether during that refresh token stuff, whether the policy is being re-evaluated, yes or no. And also here, in most cases you want to keep this enabled because you want to make sure you have conditional access for a reason. But there could be some specific policies where you want to have that resilience defaults disabled.
There's one last, and that's the required token protection for sign-in sessions. That's in preview at the moment.
Yeah, that's in preview. What we see here, all kinds of there are all kinds of toolkits available now which can actually steal the session token, to say so, and bring that to another system, where on that system, for as long as the token is active, people can start using that session to connect to the environment. And again, don't get me wrong if I have no complete overview yet of what this is doing, but it's actually making sure that if you now get an access token, it will be bound to the device by using the TPM. And because it's bound to the device, you are not able to transfer that token to any other device, making it non-usable for attackers if they somehow get that token and do something with that.
Yeah, it's a very important add-on because it's now, from my opinion, there a big flaw in the conditional access. When you get a token and you move the token to an incompliant device from an incompliant location without MFA, you're in. So it's really bad, and it's very easy with the MFA methods Kenneth already mentioned. With the unsecure MFA methods, you can easy get the session token. So it's a big problem. There are many pen tests going on. If you send a mail to 10 people, I think from 5 people you get a session cookie. From my experience.
That's and hopefully this will be helps to restrict that once.
Yeah, but support is now a little bit limited, and again there's a dependency, of course, on the device itself, so it will not work. It's not like a setting that you can enable for any conditional access policy, but hopefully in the future we will actually at least have it for all our MFA policies. Therefore, hoping that we can mitigate these risks, for the most part. Yeah.
Last thing I want to highlight is the terms of use. Within conditional access, we have the possibility to use and make use of the terms of use. So we can set up a terms of use document that is granted within your organization. So before access to Exchange Online or the data, you can require signage of a document terms of use. That can also be done with the settings that we already discussed within conditional access.
Yeah, so just as you say it, if you have like guest users requiring access to your environment, give them the terms of use first, which they have to accept. And then after the terms of use are accepted, they are allowed access to the company data. And the terms of use itself, it's like a PDF document, and they should contain all kinds of maybe legal HR documentation on what the options are to in order for you to be able to give access to the environment. Yeah.
Okay. Joost, what do we have in the corner?
Cannon's Corner, yeah. I think a good one too, when you're going to set up conditional access, because we've been talking about licensing as well, but Azure AD, the simple steps, business premium and that kind of stuff. What's the minimal license we need to get in touch with conditional access?
Azure AD, premium.
Is it premium, P1?
Yeah. And we can enable the security defaults, which is like a minimal subset. It's not conditional access, but it gives the same functionality as conditional access, blocking legacy authentication, requiring MFA, etc., but without the flexibility of conditional access.
Yeah.
So you either enable security defaults, which is enabled on each tenant by default,
for everyone,
or you have to use a P1 or P2 Azure AD functionality.
Yeah, but the security defaults are available for Azure AD free as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what's your advice?
Well, my advice is if you have like a really simple tenant, to at least start using the security defaults. And to give you, that's quite interesting, Microsoft started reaching out to customers who don't have an Azure AD premium tenant last week with an email asking them to enable the security defaults if you don't have them enabled yet. Yep. So for new tenants, they enable it. They give customers the option to enable it if it's not already enabled. So they are not going to enable it for you. But I can imagine that maybe in the future they will, just as number matching, start enabling it for customers if they detect that all customers are using MFA and no legacy authentication anymore.
Okay.
Yeah. Last one in Cannon's Corner. It's the Microsoft templates itself. Is that a good start for someone is going to create a new policy set?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the templates cover actually all the scenarios which should at least be covered. There's one caveat there, and that's that the break class accounts are not excluded.
But in the templates, you also see them back in Azure Lighthouse.
Yeah.
If you want them. I also have something for Cannon's Corner. I don't know if I hold it my head.
Yeah.
But conditional access is a security feature.
Yep.
But I always look also how secure is it. I see some flaws, for example, the token protection. Another flaw, and I am not sure what's the opinion of Kenneth on that. A normal user in your company can download all the conditional access policies. So every member user in your Azure AD can download and see the complete configuration. From a security perspective, from a firewall, you can see all your firewall rules. I think Microsoft didn't fix it, but what's your opinion about that?
Yeah.
With the row tools from Dirk Manoir, for example.
Yeah. So that can, especially if you have a not well thought of conditional access design and people are able to download the rules, they can easily pick which routes to take in order to circumvent them. So I think that can be a security risk. Yeah.
Okay.
On the other hand, if you look at a firewall, you can also have tooling which checks which ports are open, yes or no. And I don't believe in being able to accomplish a 100% secure environment with conditional access. But I always say, let's first focus on making it better than the security of your neighbor tenant. And use it as one of the ways to secure your environment. But I would be the last one to state that I can fully protect a tenant using conditional access only.
Yeah, I think I can have a lot of questions more about this topic. Monitoring, workbooks using and all that sort of that kind of stuff.
If you have any questions, send them in, and maybe we can do a frequently asked questions about conditional access.
Yeah, and probably we can add that one as well. A frequently asked session, question session on the Modern Workplace series. We will do that as the last. So questions from you as a listener. So send us, and we will cover them in the last recording. We have also a session about monitoring that will come up. So let's take the part of workbooks within Azure AD to that one.
Yeah.
Probably we can highlight a few workbooks that can be used, and they are very useful to get insights about the usage of conditional access, the usage of multi-factor in your environment as well. Let's do that. To wrap it up, we have seen security defaults for the free tenants, conditional access for premium, Azure AD premium tenants. So please use them, enable multi-factor, get access to your environment based on conditions. That is what conditional access is. And you can use a lot of stuff.
Yeah, and take a step-by-step approach. Don't do it because you want to do it, but make sure that it aligns with what your customers want. Also, important remark, if you are not ready for conditional access yet, even if you have premium P1, you can enable the security defaults. That's always better than having nothing, to say so. So, you have all kinds of options. And that's what makes our work interesting. At each customer, the options are different.
Yeah, and what we already saw in the portal, a few items have the preview label on it. So new functionality is coming in, and probably in about a year there are other things as well.
Indeed, also here, conditional access policies keep evolving. Make sure that you regularly review what's possible and update.
Joost is say that our time is up.
Yeah.
So let's finish this one up. Thanks for listening. Thanks for being here on the table, Joost, Kenneth, Erik, and let's do another recording in a few weeks. Thank you.
Thanks, Frans.
Thank you.